Welcome everyone to Birmingham Cathedral, both in the cathedral and on the live stream. Can I encourage you to take your seat if you're in the cathedral and we can get underway. So my name's Andy Dalmage, I'm Canon Missioner here. Welcome to those in the cathedral, and we've got a lot of people watching on the live stream as well, so welcome to you. Welcome to our second annual Bishop Gore lecture on creating communities of courage and resilience. So we had two workshops today as well with slightly different titles, so I'm making sure I get the right one. And a special welcome to Professor Gillian Ahlgren, who's over from the States and came from Assisi yesterday to be with us today. And I think somebody who's probably the best placed person there is to help guide us through pathways of spirituality and rebuilding after trauma. So it's wonderful to have you with us, Gillian. Just before we begin, a couple of bits of housekeeping. If you need the toilets, they're through that door there, an accessible one on this floor and down the stairs for the other ones. If the fire alarms go off, we're not expecting them to, so please leave by those doors or those doors. There'll be a steward guiding you out on each one, and the assembly point is at the Burnaby Monument, which is the great phallic object out in the churchyard. Obviously, we're dealing with some potentially triggering stuff in terms of thinking through trauma, so trigger warning to you. If you need to go out, my colleagues on the door will look after you and guide you out. If you need somebody to talk to, we'll organise that for you. This is happening during our Loud Fence Week. Loud Fence is a survivor-led initiative to have visibility and positivity for survivors. And it's also about the church saying, we are sorry, you are important, we will listen to you, we will help and support you, and we will do our best to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And as a sign of that, there's a chance to tie a ribbon all this week to the fence over on Colmore Row or the railings just inside our foyer. We'll make sure we finish by 9 o'clock. Gillian's going to speak for a while, and then there'll be a chance to ask questions. If you're on the live stream, you can submit them via the chat function on the YouTube channel, and my colleague Rebecca's sorting all of that out. And obviously there'll be a chance for those of you in the building as well to ask questions, and I hope we'll be able to have some good conversation. I'm going to be quiet now, and welcome Gillian Ahlgren.
Thank you so much, Andy. Good evening. I'd like to begin with thanks to Canon Missioner Andy Dalmage for the invitation to be here, and certainly to, let's get that. You got it? Okay, we don't want that down. To the Cathedral staff for all of your work, putting this day together, and to all of you for being here. It has been a full day. After 2 workshops with caregivers around the city of Birmingham and beyond, I'm grateful for the opportunity this evening to reflect with you at the intersection of trauma, Christian theology, and Christian spirituality. That intersection is a very real space, a gripping and exhausting one at times, even as it is a life-altering space and a tender space. It is a space that is not new to the Christian community, and yet also, as we stand here in the 21st century, It is a space that presents us with unique challenges and possibilities. Standing at the intersection of trauma, theology, and spirituality, as I have discovered, can help us realize what really matters as human persons. And it can certainly teach us how to make good on our covenantal commitment to the God of love. Tonight's lecture will consist of 3 basic parts, and I have them listed on slide 2. Yeah. We will review briefly the experience of trauma and post-trauma, as we have been learning about trauma's impact over the past 30 years of research and clinical and pastoral experience. Next, we will turn to Christian theology for insight and Christian spirituality for practical wisdom. Finally, in the 3rd section, we will gain inspiration from faith communities that embody a Christian vision of transformation and hope. We will see this in more detail later, but I should say right here at the outset that the beautiful and inspiring art that accompanies us along the way on this slide and here in the Cathedral space has been created by the community of House of Peace in Chicago, a transformative, intentional community for Latina women and children who have survived domestic violence. And we'll learn more about them soon. So our next slide. We're going to start with the phenomenology of trauma in order to recognize the signs of trauma and its impact on us personally, on populations that have experienced more intense forms of trauma, and on the human community more generally. We will need to adopt an interdisciplinary approach and a constructive methodology informed by the experiences of those who can best tell us what it is to live with, around, and through trauma. And we will mine the Christian tradition for conceptual resources, individual figures, and spiritual practices that can enlighten us about metanoia, the change of heart, mind, attitude, behavior, and perspective that John the Baptist called for and Jesus taught, modeled, and embodied. Metanoia that gradually leads us to collaborative partnership with the divine in a complex and traumatizing world. It is important for us to begin at the intersection of trauma and spirituality because that's where we are. In 2022, I think I can state it plainly, we live in a traumatizing world. With a global pandemic, economic and political challenges at home and abroad, warfare disrupting so many national borders, violence in our homes and communities, global warming and increasing climate disasters, unless we are willfully closing our eyes to reality, coping with trauma is part of our daily experience. Even as we don't speak of this underside of daily life, and we walk amidst so many walking wounded. If nothing else, in this evening, by taking a moment to understand the impact of trauma on the human psyche and on our relationships with one another, this at least can help us today to heed a little better the counsel of the prophet Micah, that our God asks one thing of us: to act justly, to love tenderly, and to walk humbly with our God. And by doing that, to contribute to a wiser, more humane, and more sane world. And so we're going to take what Jesuit theologian Walter Burghardt once called a long, loving look at the real. This requires us to notice and recognize dissonance, suffering, malice, and other challenging things. Our gaze is not always easy to sustain. And so I want to begin this evening's lecture with a scriptural passage as a reminder that when we take our world seriously and try to love it into a better place, we are not alone. We are deeply with God in the very act of doing so. And we follow in the footsteps of so many who have gone before us and have wise counsel and advice to give us. So let's start with the prophet Habakkuk. Our next slide. How long, O Lord? I cry for help, but you do not listen. I cry out to you violence, but you do not intervene. Why do you let me see ruin? Why must I look at misery? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and clamorous discord. Then the Lord answered me and said, write down the vision clearly upon the tablets so that it can be read easily. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and will not disappoint. If it delays, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not be late. I want to suggest at the outset of this evening that the prophetic instinct exemplified by this passage, the instinct to engage dialogue with the divine in light of the challenges faced by God's people, is not only a tradition common to Christianity and Judaism, it is also a contemporary strategy for daily life. Prayerful dialogue with God and with one another is and should be what we could call our first response as people of faith living in a traumatizing world. For when we begin to grasp how destabilizing trauma is, we should recognize easily how much we need a grounding, a safe space, in order to live with integrity and not lose ourselves in the chaos. Relationship with the divine, indeed, right relationship with God, self, and other, is that safe space, and trauma threatens to dislodge and uproot it from us, or uproot us from our own safe space. Let's take a look at what trauma does. Next slide. Trauma can be defined as, quote, harrowing personal or communal experience that exceeds our normal abilities to cope. And I'm going to use words from the pioneer in trauma studies, Judith Herman, who wrote almost 30 years ago that, quote, by definition, trauma overwhelms us, rendering us helpless, disrupting our sense of order, our capacities, our control, our connections, even our sense of meaning. Trauma inspires helplessness and terror. Traumatic events are extraordinary not because they occur rarely, but because they overwhelm ordinary human adaptations to life. Traumatic experiences can leave us feeling overwhelmed, emotionally flooded, or by contrast, numb, disoriented, unsure of ourselves, no longer able to trust others or to trust our own ability to perceive reality correctly. Traumatic reactions, Herman writes, occur when action is of little to no avail. When a person is overwhelmed by terror and helplessness, the whole apparatus for concerted, coordinated, and purposeful activity is smashed. Trauma survivors can hold cognitive, affective, and spiritual dissonances so intense and painful as to be nearly intolerable. And yet, you may be the colleague, friend, even family member of a traumatized person and not know it. We have all heard the phrase cognitive dissonance, the painful clash of conflicting perceptions, if you look it up. Trauma involves the experience not just of cognitive dissonance, conflicting perceptions, but conflicting realities. A threatening reality which imposes itself upon our psyche and upon our very being, our very existence at times, since trauma is often understood to be life-threatening in one way or another. It is a reality that threatens to change everything in our lives: our stability, our relationships with others, our ability to cope, much less to thrive. Let's go to slide 6. Many people experience trauma as a shattering of self, of connection, of meaning, of capacity. Traumatic events can cause profound and lasting changes in emotion, cognition, and memory. Moreover, traumatic events may sever these normally integrated functions from one another. Unattended to, traumatic symptoms can become disconnected from their source and take on a life of their very own. When levels of this dissonance we've been talking about, cognitive, affective, and spiritual dissonances, become so intense and painful as to be intolerable, survivors can also become vulnerable in post-trauma to various forms of addiction that compound the challenges of living. In a helpful early reflection on trauma, Judith Herman used the word unspeakable to describe some of the unimaginable things that human beings have endured. And it is that very unspeakability of trauma that can make it somewhat intractable. Not only do many survivors not want to speak of it, they are often made to feel that no one wants to hear what they have to say or will believe what has happened to them, much less know how to respond to it. But in the past 5 to 10 minutes, we've already seen that trauma overwhelms the individual. Therefore, it requires a response beyond what the survivor alone may be able to make. So Herman writes, traumatic events by definition thwart initiative and overwhelm individual competence. No matter how brave and resourceful the victim may have been, her or his actions were insufficient to ward off the disaster that they have experienced. Trauma's capacity to silence us points to the first thing I believe that we need to consider as Christians living in a traumatizing world. The burden, in some senses, is on us We need to know, to recognize, and to watch for signs of post-trauma in ourselves and in one another. And so I'm going to put some of these symptoms and signs up for a moment so that you can see them almost like a shopping list. Slide 7, there we go, thank you. And when you see them, I think they begin to speak for themselves. Tension, anxiety, startle reflex should be up there somewhere, yeah? Easily startled under behavioral reactions. Lack of energy, nightmares, intrusive memories, poor attention, irritability, numbness, inability to feel, depression, withdrawal. Let's just take a minute to review this list, not only for ourselves, but to hold in prayer anyone we know, anyone we don't know, who might be suffering from some of these reactions. When we are traumatized, we have experienced the untrustworthiness of life, often in a deeply personal way. Our trust in a single person, a group of people, a family system, or even a whole community, a culture or social system may have been violated. If so, when so, such betrayals are not easily remedied. Further, how people respond to us in the aftermath, when we have been violated, plays a critical role in the life cycle of a traumatic experience and how we process it. When trauma is denied, that is, when survivors are not believed or supported, a further level of trauma wraps itself around the initial experience and can lead to disconnection, isolation, loss of function, and even loss of meaning. Let's go to our next slide. This is a paragraph that made a very strong impression upon me as a theologian, as an educator, and as a pastoral worker. In it, I think Judith Herman summarizes holistically the impact of trauma by saying, traumatic events call into question basic human relationships. They breach the attachments of family, friendship, love, and community. They shatter the construction of self that has been formed and sustained in relation to others. They can undermine the belief systems that give meaning to human experience. They can violate the victim's faith in a natural or divine order and cast the victim into a state of existential crisis. The damage to relational life is not a secondary effect of trauma as originally thought. Traumatic events have primary effects not only on the psychological structures of the self, but also on the systems of attachment, meaning, and connection that link individual and community. Traumatic events destroy the victim's fundamental assumptions about the safety of the world and the safety of the community, the positive value of the self, and even the meaningful order of creation. She goes on to point out, in situations of terror, people often spontaneously seek their first source of comfort and protection, crying out for their mothers, their loved ones, their God. If this cry is not answered, a sense of basic trust can be shattered. And then traumatized people can feel abandoned, alone, cast out of the human and divine systems of care and protection that sustain life. Because trauma shatters us, it can also shut us down. Neurochemically, of course, and there's plenty of literature on the neurochemistry of trauma that would bear that out. But trauma can also shut us down emotionally, intellectually, creatively, and imaginatively, trapping us in cycles of post-trauma when trauma is reactivated, and we are again captive to symptoms like hypervigilance, withdrawal, fear of crowds, apathy, obsessive thinking. Trauma reactivation can lead to cycles of behavioral or substance-based addictions, or both. And while it may seem that there is little we can do to resist or fight back against something that so systematically and comprehensively disables us, that is simply not true. If I can say nothing else this evening, I need to say the next sentence, that trauma does not need to have the last word in our world. And the human community, particularly the Christian community, has a large role to play in not allowing trauma to have the last word. How we respond as human beings, both to the traumatized and to a world that traumatizes us, is, I argue, the critical question of the 21st century. So now that we know more about the impact of trauma and how disabling it can be, it is time for us to shift gears and try to inhabit more intelligently a space of presence, of accompaniment, and of solidarity with those who have been traumatized, meeting them in their space of need. If, as Herman pointed out just a moment ago, when this cry for comfort and protection is not answered, a sense of basic trust can be shattered. This basic human anguish is spoken of clearly in Scripture over and over. The Lord hears the cry of the poor. Who will hear my cry? The suffering servant of Psalm 22. I cried out by day, but you did not answer, by night, but there was no rest for me. Even Christ's own entreaty to his closest companions in the Garden of Gethsemane. Stay with me. Stay with me. Christian theology, and so now we're shifting into the second portion of the lecture tonight. Christian theology gives us many points of entry as we seek to find our place in a dangerous world and to find the moral courage and abiding commitment to do right by those who have been trampled down. We have scriptural resources that help us live in paradox and encourage us in practices of solidarity and accompaniment that feed the transformation of self and society. Let's start with one point of entry for reading the world around us, the point of entry of paradox, when all seems lost, and yet perhaps there is something more than meets the eye. Sorry, I have to take a jump from my script here and just gesture to the beautiful painting in front of me up here, which is called by the artist and the community behind it, The Hidden God. The artistic commentary to this painting goes something like, God's presence is around us and pervades all creation, and yet, even in its midst, we don't always see or know or experience it. And so we have Paul, for example, in Scripture reminding us that in my weakness, I am strong. The paradox of that. And in societies and cultures that value autonomy, achievement, and the veneer of superiority, as ours often do, we need a hidden invitation to a different way. Our vulnerability, especially when it is made so deeply known to us through trauma, can serve as a point of entry into a deeper relationship with God and a deeper search for and creation of trustworthy communities of recovery and growth after trauma. We also have Jesus' reminder when we ask, "Where did we see you?" That Christ is here with us in the hungry, the poor, the abandoned, the trampled down. This inverted perspective, this instinct that God is somehow present despite the messiness of this world, waiting to be found, asking, in fact, as Christ asked his closest companions in Gethsemane, for us to stay with me, that is, not to look away in the face of human distress and despair. Stay with me in the fullness of Christian development can become a commitment to presence, to walking with people through stages of healing, empowerment, and self-realization in communities of mutual growth. Stay with me is a plea that also invites us into a healthy and rigorous moral curiosity about what it is that is traumatizing people. For trauma is often an experience of injustice, of violence or abuse, of criminal neglect, or even of active human malice. Being exposed to those forces in disabling ways gives us a strong taste of what in no way pleases God. In fact, it is this negative way, that bottoming out space where something in us cries out, there has got to be something more, something other, something different, something better than this. And that space frees us to look beyond our cultural values for what brings hope, strength, healing, and a different, better way. Many of Christianity's spiritual teachers knew this from their own raw experience. Francis of Assisi, for example, I just came to you from the City of Peace on Francis's feast day on Tuesday. He actually spent a year as a prisoner of war and was never the same after that. Ultimately, many, many lives became better because he was unwilling and unable to return to business as usual after being struck down in the violence of war. Oscar Romero pulled out of the books he loved and into the harsh truth of the Salvadoran disappeared when his own friend Rutilio Grande was assassinated. We can and should mine the experience of Christianity's greatest prophets and reformers for their insights into trauma and recovery. For many of their spiritual itineraries have parallels to the challenges that we face today. Christian spirituality is ultimately about collaborative partnership with the divine. collaborative partnership with the divine, not in some future space, and not only in those moments when we feel peace or when we feel ready to collaborate with the divine, but here, now and always, and especially now, in a world permeated with trauma and its aftermath. If we take as our point of departure that theology is an activity of reflection, interpretation, construction, and transformation, then a truly meaningful theological statement, not a platitude that pleases the ear or feeds us a belief that we want to hold, but a truly meaningful theological statement must demonstrate its truth by being relevant, helpful, and transformative. For theology to matter, and I'm saying this, mind you, as a theologian, so it's a standard I try to hold myself to every day, it must be able to truly change things, particularly things that are clearly not right. Theology, which is to say, how we understand and speak about God, must help us see the world differently, must help us reimagine ourselves and our world in the light of what God wants for us and with us. The good news of the Christian tradition must be able to bring hope, freedom, and safety, flourishing for those who have been trampled down. And there are more of these than ever. Some of us gathered tonight among them, each of us with a different story, interrupted, transformed, mysterious, and powerful, that can and ought to reflect the light and love of God at work in us and in our world. Jesuit theologian Kevin Burke used to press theological statements with his trademark question, yes, but does it liberate? And he would measure the relevance and worth of theological concepts and statements by probing their liberative potential. To his trademark question, we can add, yes, but does it transform? Does what we say about God and what we profess to believe change us and make the world around us a more just, more sustainable, and a more humane place? Does it promote encounter with the incarnate one in our midst, inviting and challenging us to collaborate with God in the work of remaking our world? What happens, now that we've defined theology and spirituality, when we integrate theology and spirituality and allow them to take the place that they belong in our own lives? Put another way, especially given the prevalence of trauma today, we can ask, now we're ready to move to slide 9. Yeah, there we go. What happens when we allow post-trauma to be a space of theological reflection and spiritual growth? This question might at first seem mal-apropos, but trauma forces questions of meaning and therefore can draw us into constructive theology, particularly when we ask and try to notice how God is experienced after traumatic loss. When we ask, what does it mean to be community in this space of loss? Does the reality of incarnation hold true in the physical absence of Christ? What does it mean to make up the body of Christ? Jesus' earliest companions had to ask these questions and many more as they struggled in the aftermath of the disappearance of their closest friend and wisest teacher. So let's go to the next slide. We actually have a black and white picture right in the center here of Diana Ortiz, who passed away just last year. And I'd like to take a moment to examine how Diana Ortiz courageously held the dissonances and tensions of post-trauma in her contemporary response to Christ's plea, "Stay with me." We can think of this whole process, and I think it's an important way to think of this phrase I'm going to throw out there, creative fidelity. We can think of what she did as a profound and inspiring example of creative fidelity, a space of relationship with God to which we are all called. Can we go to the next slide? I've got a chronology here. Yeah, here we go. So if you're not familiar with Diana Ortiz, I just want to give you a little nutshell sketch. She joined the Order of St. Ursula while still in college. She was 19 years old. And her family says that she always wanted to be a nun. Her university degree in childhood education soon had her working with youth in rural Guatemala. Now, you may remember the context of Guatemala in the mid-1980s. The disappearance of individuals, even massacres of villages, and what was called a scorched earth policy that few people were left to even talk about. As she took to heart the work of educating and being with the people around her, Diana began to receive death threats, and they gave her pause. She went into Guatemala City to a retreat center to pray and reflect about what she should do. While she was there, she was approached on the grounds of the retreat center by two men who abducted her and drove her to a detention center. Only years later was Diana able to tell people some of what happened to her under detention. 24 hours into this detention, a man others called Alejandro entered Diana's cell. He tore off her blindfold, looked at her face, and swore in American-accented Spanish that this prisoner would need to be moved from her cell because of pressures from the international community. During that transfer, Diana escaped. But outside the prison complex, restoring any kind of normality to her life proved nearly impossible. The U.S. ambassador to Guatemala quickly denied that Diana could have been tortured, despite 111 cigarette burns on her back. When Diana decided to pursue justice against Alejandro and her torturers, she requested a Freedom of Information Act file in order to identify him and file precise charges. It took her over 4 years and a month-long hunger strike outside the White House simply to get the files of information. For Diana, as for many, many trauma survivors, it is not only the initial event, experience, or relationship that traumatizes. It is also the way that the human community responds to people who have been traumatized. With apathy, ignorance, or even, as Diana experienced, with outright denial and active coercion to keep silent about what they have suffered. Diana had companions and allies on the road to recovery, but it took her nearly 10 years to compose a narrative account of what she had suffered. And actually, that narrative account is in the back of the room of the cathedral. You can pick it up if you like. There's several books on the piano that are there for your review. Next slide. Yeah. And when she did finally find her voice, she created a space for the human community to look unflinchingly at the unknown, ignored, and sometimes actively denied suffering in its very midst. She didn't do it often, but you could hear a pin drop when Diana spoke publicly. She would light a candle every time she spoke about her experience, saying, "While I speak, the flame of this candle will burn in remembrance of those who have been tortured and those who are being tortured at this very moment." Where could such a place be where God dies? Has your life ever taken you there? We're still on that backslide. Mine has. Let me share with you where it was for me. And while I do, please remember that there are others in that place at this very moment as I speak. Stay with me. This promise, this commitment to those who Diana saw, heard, smelled in the detention center, never left her. Next slide. That's the chronology. Yep, so now we're back here in 1994. Diana began working at the Guatemalan Human Rights Commission in Washington, D.C., and there she came into contact with other survivors of torture. She was struck by the common language that they used to describe their experience of trauma and its impact. And this shared understanding gave her insight necessary to start the first organization led by torture survivors for other torture survivors. Diana Ortiz provides an example of how to model a completely integrated theological ethical response of witnessing, of remaining, of embodying the love that does not leave us, of being a presence that helps us to prophetically embody the demands of the gospel and become an empowering collaborator with the incarnate one known in our midst. If we look at this chronology, we see how creative fidelity continually took new forms and shapes in her life as solidarity with others, especially those left behind, bore fruit in prophetic denunciation of torture and in keen commitment to those who had suffered it. Diana made a promise, and she tells us this in her book, The Blindfold's Eye. She made a promise to a woman in the detention center that she met while she was there. "I will not forget you." She gradually recognized in this deeply human response of one person to another the presence of the incarnate God. And in her life, we can see how this relational commitment evoked so many creative responses. Next slide. Diana epitomizes a practice of remaining. Trauma theologian Shelley Rambo coined this phrase, remaining, and probes a space she calls the Holy Saturday space, which is a space that at some level the Christian community continues to live, especially since the human community continues to crucify. The ongoing reality of trauma in the human story points to the need to configure a theology of resurrection that links the promise of Christian theology to the realities of trauma that we are witnessing in our time. A former student of mine who has worked with the community of House of Peace that we're going to learn more about, in listening to survivor stories, has herself coined a phrase, fragile resurrection. to describe this process. I find these reflections helpful, although I continue to use relational language like creative fidelity to accentuate the gospel call, stay with me, and to point to a theology of presence that facilitates and guides transformation. We can also recover an ancient Christian word, metanoia, which I referred to at the very beginning. A change of mind, heart, attitude, disposition, practices that guides and facilitates. It's the energy, it's the motor behind transformation. This was the primary energy in the community that Jesus nurtured. And we can begin to correlate metanoia with habits and practices that we develop in community. Habits and practices of solidarity, of resistance, of growth, of flourishing. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. And so we are called to be communities of metanoia, exploring the ways, the many ways, that the ongoing reality of trauma in the human story requires us to inhabit creatively the liminal space of Holy Saturday, the between space of crucifixion and resurrection. That's our call. That's the invitation. And the good news is we don't have to do that alone. It would be tremendously overwhelming to try to hold that space alone. In my experience as a theologian, these experiments in communities of transformation and growth, mutual support and accompaniment, are what best teach us about the living God. And in my experience accompanying the traumatized, these experiments in community are necessary when trying to address traumatic effects that have, as Herman has already put it, overwhelmed the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. We need all of us, traumatized or not, to relearn connection and meaning in the context of a community that proves its trustworthiness in daily practices that promote healing, transformation, and growth. I have seen ways that these communities go a long distance in dissolving the hold that trauma often has over individuals. I've also seen how such communities have a great deal to teach us about what love is, what love looks like, what love does. Indeed, these communities provide space to witness and participate in the capacity of the incarnate God to shape and imbue us in right relationship. That is, to collaborate with God and with one another in the making of a world that is home for all. Next slide. Yay, we get to some people, not just some words. So my trajectory, and this is the third, now we're shifting into the third section of the evening. My trajectory as a person, as a theologian, and as a pastoral caregiver with unique contributions, I hope, to make in the field of post-traumatic growth began in 2009. When I had been a professor of theology, spirituality, and church history for nearly 20 years. I was drawn into work with formerly homeless women in recovery from substance abuse through the Ignatian Spirituality Project. It's a national nonprofit in the United States with pastoral teams in 28 different cities. And so I'm going to insert a bit of narrative, autoethnography, whatever they like to call that here, and share with you a little of my own journey at the intersection of pastoral care, trauma, and spirituality. And I've decided to do this so that you can see, in the same ways that I began to see, the inbreaking of God in my own life and in the communities gathered over the years to drink from our own wells, using tools from the Christian tradition that we adapted according to our own experiential wisdom. I don't know that we would have had the courage to try this if others had not already begun this journey. In our case, that is the case of the new ISP, Ignatian Spirituality Project, ISP, women's team in Cincinnati. 4 of us were invited and provided with materials from teams in other cities, and even with a retreat template. And so we found support in the area of Cincinnati from several communities of women religious with retreat centers that would provide us a space to get our project going. The retreat sizes were small, 12 women in recovery and 4 team members. This ratio made it easy to break into small groups and to draw from several local homeless shelters and recovery centers for a good mix of participants. 1 team member would facilitate each segment of a retreat, but we rotated that responsibility, each team member taking her turn, even as every team member was always a full participant in each offering. Ideally, we sought to empower women who had step 4 of the 12 Steps program, engaged a searching and fearless moral inventory, and who wanted step 11 of the 12 Steps, more conscious contact with the God of our understanding. Shelters in the United States receiving federal funding could not offer programming in spirituality, and they were grateful to us, we learned, for providing an experiential approach to solidarity, reflection, spiritual practices, and community building that grounded women's recovery process in ways that recovery centers themselves could not. Social workers from the local shelters began to help us find suitable candidates, women who had at least 3 to 6 months of sobriety, who were reflective, who wanted to grow, and had some awareness of their challenges and gifts as people. We called our work Women at the Well, an oblique reference to the Samaritan woman of John 4, and a symbol of our approach. We gathered in circles of honesty for prayerful conversation, knowing our own thirst and seeking a wellspring of inspiration, insight, and wisdom that a beloved community can explore together. Those circles were, for all of us, a baptism by fire. It took my breath away when one of the women on my first retreat shared a story of being trafficked by a family member wanting money for a drug habit. Her survival, her recovery, her ongoing struggles, her hopes, her dreams. Her words glistened with honesty, and we saw and knew ourselves in them as well. In our circles of women at the well, there is no denying either the precarity of our existence or the miracle of it. On another early retreat, it came out in our first round of introductions that nearly every single woman in the circle had been brought to life, back to life, either after domestic violence or after drug overdose, in an emergency room sometime before her 35th birthday. Everything about both the stories and the courage it took to carry on humbled us all. Those of us on the retreat teams had come to support women's dignity, to provide spiritual resources. We hadn't realized that we would receive wisdom, courage, and a fire growing in our bellies. The truths that would emerge around these circles spoke powerfully to the need for something more. There was the intolerability of the suffering endured, There was the systemic and interpersonal nature of the indignities suffered. There was the impunity of perpetrators, the knowledge of malice still active out on the streets and even behind closed doors. What would a truly appropriate response include? Support? Sure, but something more? Remediation? Restitution? Prevention? What would any of that require? Of me, of professional caregivers, of the Christian community, of society at large? Aren't these the questions we should be asking? And yet, there were a lot of questions, so to answer them, I knew I needed a much greater intelligence around trauma. And I set out to gain that knowledge both from professionals in the field and the literature, academic literature and all of this, the studies, and to integrate all of that as deeply as I could with insights in relational theology theology that I took from the tradition of Christian spirituality, hoping that somehow in an intertextual mix, I would derive in experiments, ongoing dialogical experiments with the communities, a wisdom as well as a tenacity and resilience. Judith Herman once said, and this was in a wonderful interview in which she was speaking about her life as a therapist working in the area of trauma for decades. Ultimately, if you're talking about horrible abuses of power, you're talking about the atrocious things that people do to one another. And just when you think you've heard everything, and there's nothing else you could imagine that somebody would intentionally do to another, someone comes along with a story that just about blows you away all over again. So you're dealing with very profound questions of human evil, human cruelty, the abuse of power and authority. And the antidote to that is the solidarity of resistance. Nobody can do that alone. Let's go to our next slide. Good. And so if you've read the classic Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman, you know that she discusses 5 stages of recovery after trauma. I'll just read them slowly. A healing relationship, safety, remembrance and mourning, reconnection, commonality. What do we notice? Structure, possibly sequence, but not necessarily linear, and themes of relationality. Judith Herman's emphasis on the importance of solidarity points to deeper forms of self-transcendence and relational possibility, located in the human community, but also learned and appropriated through direct contact, access, and growing relationship with the divine. And so, next slide, given my own background as a theologian, next slide, there we go. Given my own background as a theologian, church historian, and scholar of the Christian mystical tradition, the most obvious place to start looking for tools was in that very same Christian spiritual tradition. As a living witness to the transformative impact of friendship and even intimacy with God that was embodied in revolutionary and deeply inspiring leaders. So on the right, people like Francis and Clare of Assisi, Ignatius Loyola, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Dorothy Day, Oscar Romero. These authors and others provide ways of learning how to collaborate with God and with others. They speak of the possibility and the reality of growing into the kind of collaborative partnership with the divine that empowers us with courage and wisdom in contexts that are actually capable of breaking our spirit. Their texts often provide structures for growth through stages of reflection, awareness, commitment, and growing assimilation into the energy of God. And as I read and reflected on both their reflections on their own lives and the insights into relationship with God that they offered in the context in which they lived, I came to understand that they are companions in trauma as well as in spirit. The first step actually in my research was to understand contextually the kinds of trauma that many of them lived through. And I could go through and talk about each one of them, but I tried to refer to at least two examples, right? Francis, as a veteran of combat, and someone who likely experienced PTSD, especially in the early years after his return to Assisi. Oscar Romero, traumatized by the death of his dear friend, and then actively aware, concerned about, and working to stop the disappearance of his contemporaries. Slide 19. Next slide. Next slide. Great. Terrific. I spent several years reviewing texts I loved for their ability to shed light on recovery and growth after trauma. The core nugget was my sense that the same spiritual tools that have traditionally been used in the formation of Christian identity and partnership with God were also the tools that could be used for identity reformation and constructive collaboration with God after trauma. Next slide. My instincts about these things were quickly put to the test after meeting delightful Aida Segura in the center, bottom left, executive director of House of Peace in Chicago in 2013. So let me tell you a little bit about that community. It was founded in 2012, and House of Peace is an intentional community providing a 6-month residential program of transformation for Latino women and children who are fleeing domestic violence. Aida invited me to create and facilitate workshops with transformative principles, which together we began calling spiritual enrichment opportunities. And we would hold them quarterly, sometimes in an evening for several hours, sometimes a full day, and even a few times overnight retreat. Next slide. The first one was rooted in communal reflections on the soul and the experience of personhood in the writings of Teresa of Avila. And I chose this very specifically and deliberately because it was very important to communicate, it seemed very important to communicate that we are not the sum total of our experiences. We are more than that. That, despite the fact that we have chronological histories, we are more than the sum total of what has happened to us. The ancients, and even the medievals and even 16th century Teresa of Avila spoke of that dimension of our being and our personhood as the soul. Whether or not that concept and that reality makes sense in the 21st century, I can't say. But I can say that in asking people to, and reading with them, Teresa's description of that reality, all of a sudden new insights about what it meant to be human began to arise in our conversations. So the first conversation was rooted in our reflections on the soul and the expansion of the self, as Teresa describes it. We engaged quotes from her interior castle together in the form of Lectio Divina. We'd underline words or phrases that spoke to us. And then we would reflect together on how her statements about personhood, about human nature, and about relationship with God resonated with our own experiences. Excerpts like, "Let's consider our soul to be like a castle made entirely out of diamond or a very clear crystal, in which there are many rooms, just as in heaven there are many dwelling places. So what do you think that dwelling place will be like? This place where God, so powerful, so wise, so pure, so full of all good things, takes delight. I cannot find anything comparable to its beauty." Or her reflection, "It's a pity that we are so blind as not to understand ourselves or know who we most deeply are. Would it not show great ignorance for a person not to know who his parents were or what country she comes from? How much more blindness do we show when we hardly know our own souls? Yet we seldom consider all the precious secrets contained within us, and so we make little effort to preserve our own deepest beauty." Two more quotes that I didn't have space for, and this one, the third one, rings so true to so many women who've experienced this reality very deeply. Teresa asks, "Can there be an evil greater than that of being ill at ease in our own house? What hope can we have of finding rest outside of ourselves if we cannot be at rest within? Remember that you cannot begin to recollect yourselves by force, but only by gentleness if your recollection is going to be more continual." Next slide, and I'm afraid the picture in it won't do justice, but several weeks after that first workshop, I received a package in the mail. The women of House of Peace had conceived an art project based on what they decided was their favorite quote from the workshop. "Let us remember that within us is a palace of immense beauty." And you can't entirely tell it from this slide, but it actually consisted of 7 different layers representing the 7 stages or 7 dwelling places in Teresa's interior castle, beginning with a thick piece of cardboard and burlap, kind of the coarseness of the superficiality of our being. And then one layer after another layer after another layer, until finally the jewel in the center, recreating the joy of discovering the beauty of the soul and its capacity in God for goodness. Over time, House of Peace Arts Therapy program grew under the capable leadership of Carmela Ramirez, known as Carmen, Maestra Carmen. Carmen's community-based approach extracts hidden talent from the women and children in the House of Peace community. Much of her artwork is based on her deep listening to the stories, suffering, hopes, aspirations, and prayers of the women. Next slide. Great. As director of House of Peace, Aida Segura says, "In a way, Carmen is like a midwife who aids the process of birthing a new vision of life and hope in the survivors, helping them to express the transformation that takes place in their lives at House of Peace." Artist Maestra Carmen herself says, "I like to paint in the spirit of gratitude. I see others' virtues and talents. I like to maximize the goodness of the community and turn it into an opportunity to express their beauty and strength." The artwork that has emerged over the 10 years of this community is inspiring and profound, particularly when it is paired with the words of the women who have created it. Aida and Carmen wanted me to share images from their most recent collection entitled Hope in Bloom. Next slide. Right. This one, which we've reflected on all day, called Exodus with the God Who Accompanies Us. This painting, this is the artist's comment, represents the pathways of the women and children who do not know their destination. Yet there is always a light and spiritual force that guides and strengthens. This represents the paths of the immigrants who put their trust and faith in God. God responds to them and accompanies them. Next. Somos universo. We are the universe. This is a painting of dreams, part of our imagination. The woman is dreaming of night and stars, clouds, family, flowers. She dreams of the sun, of the future. She dreams of serenity, which is represented by water. It is through dreaming and hope that we discover our belonging in the universe and the miracle of life. Next image. Peace in the world. You can see it right in front of me. This painting represents life and peace on earth. It includes many things from nature: mountains, light, harmony on earth. The heart of peace is love. Next, the hidden God. God has created everything for us. God is in everything, a hidden presence that is in front of our eyes, but we often don't initially recognize that presence. Mujeres de la Esperanza, women of hope. I think we have one more image. Yeah. So I thought it was very important for us as we grapple with the problem of trauma in our world to also see from communities that are exploring and experiencing together the possibility of new life what our work consists of. Becoming trauma-sensitive communities will require three things of Christian communities. First, do no harm. Second, commit to prioritizing intelligent care to the traumatized as an act of solidarity and creative fidelity to the God who continues to suffer within the human community. Third, commit to the work of trauma prevention, specifically by understanding the forces at work in our world that traumatize and dehumanize us. Courageously denounce and resist them. Create alternatives. Take deep care in how we speak about and explore together our human reality and our possibility as humans in union with our God. Got 3 more slides. Working with traumatized people requires a committed moral stance. We need to understand the fundamental injustice of the traumatic experience and capacitate human flourishing. Our fundamental commitment in this work is to create and sustain trustworthy relationships. We must prove ourselves worthy of the trust of the traumatized. And as we do that, we will find the spirit of good, of goodness, awakened within us. Next slide. We can return to Judith Thurman's 5 stages for recovery after trauma that were first developed in the 1990s, and we can say these are the stages: safety and stability, empowerment and autonomy as they connect to trustworthy relationships, communities of solidarity, resistance, and growth, and mutual accountability in our relationships with one another. Next slide, our final reminder. Yeah? Good. In nurturing the transformation of lives after trauma, we see and bear witness to God's constancy, God's creativity, God's tenderness, filling in gaps and spaces where trauma has dislodged God's lavishness and ubiquity, has shattered not just us, but our awareness of God's presence and the goodness it ignites. We all benefit by deepening humanity's beautiful and God-given capacity to be bearers of light and love in our world. May it be so. Amen.
Gillian, thank you so much. That was wonderful and rich and deep and huge amounts to think and reflect on. Just looking at my watch, it's almost 9:05. And I wonder, rather than trying to take questions now and not being able to do justice to them, if we can think of a way of having an ongoing conversation. I wonder perhaps for those in the cathedral and those on the live stream, whether we could come up with a way of people submitting questions, and perhaps we have a Zoom in a few weeks where people could join in. Do you think that might be a good way to do that and enable us just to reflect a bit? So if you just have a reflect, and if you've got any questions, you could give them to me in the next 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or alternatively, if you email inquiries@birminghamcathedral.com, inquiries@birminghamcathedral.com, we'll assemble some questions and have a bit of reflect on them, and then we'll organise a Zoom meeting sometime in the next month and get a date out to everybody. Would that be okay? And just have a bit of, do justice, I think, to reflecting on what's very deep and important. Is that okay? So, once again, so thank you very much, everybody, for coming and for watching on the live stream. And again, thank you very much to Professor Gillian Ahlgren for all your time and commitment, not just this evening, and the rest of today, but to survivors and to post-traumatic growth. So thank you, Gillian.